Good evening, everyone. I can see, a few of you already starting to come in. Hello. Please, as ever, note on the chat where you're from, what country you're on today. The last couple of weeks have been very strange, with some of us emerging from lockdown and some of us being locked down even more. So it is even more super fantastic to see you all this week for NAVA's weekly advocacy workshop. I'm Esther Anatolitis. I'm the Executive Director of NAVA, and today I'm on the lands of the Bunwarang and the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, whose sovereignty was never ceded. This place, I'm actually not too far from the lands, the traditional gathering places of the Yallikat Willam people, and on a fairly overcast-ish kind of day. And so I'm especially happy to be here with all of you. Gabrielle Sullivan in Perth on Wachak Noongarland, hello again. Jennifer Monday's trying to cross the border from Wodonga to Albury. Can I just say, Jennifer, good luck. We're all counting on you. Kerry McKenzie, yes. Hello to all the Victorian shut-ins. Ian Provost from Wagstaff, hello. Now you can see Nicholas Pickard has joined us. We'll say a quick hi and I'll give him a formal introduction a little bit later. But hello, Nick.
Hello.
Tell us now about where you are today and the interesting objects on your wall.
Well, I'm on the traditional lands of the Wadi Wadi and the Wandandian people. So I want to acknowledge elders in this area on the south coast of New South Wales, and their elders past, present and emerging. And as you can see, I'm actually on holidays around the Jervis Bay area, and the whalers cottage that I'm staying in has beautiful shell art. There's lots of it, so Esther's been admiring it quite a lot, so hopefully you all do too.
And extra special thank you for joining us during a week of leave. It's so fantastic to be able to have this conversation while you are away. Now, Nick did mention earlier that he is joining us by the very complex, kind of tin can phone tethering to the window situation. And so we're very much hoping that that is going to survive. And I think as I've mentioned before, my internet connection has also sometimes been not so great. The good people of internet land are going to come in on Friday and fix it. So we all need to harness the deities of the internet and keep us all together for the next hour and a half. Alex Martin is saying big hugs to all the Victorians from Alex on Ngunnawal Ngambri land in Canberra. Kerry is asking, are you in Husky?
Close to Husky. I'm in just around the corner on Hymes Beach.
Lovely. And Bronwyn Colston is welcoming you to the region, encouraging you to drop into the Shoalhaven Regional Gallery in Nowra.
That's a great idea. It's pouring with rain here, so it's it's an even better idea.
Fantastic. And hello, Julie from One Country in Armidale. So fantastic to see you all. So those of us who have been in for the long haul with our advocacy program have been through a series of conversations. We've talked about specific issues in the arts for the first 4 weeks, and of course that has been coming back. That's our important theme. We've started out talking to artists and key peak bodies. We then spent a few weeks looking at policy, how it gets made, what some key issues are. We've then spoken about the media, how to engage with the media, how those kinds of, news structures work, and how to be a media spokesperson. And now in our last 4 weeks, before we head into Arts Down the Hill, which we'll talk about in our workshop session at 5, we now have 4 weeks focusing on the politics. So what is that relationship between the people we elect, the people who advise them, and the ways that that policy and great outcomes are made? We've got a couple of really interesting speakers coming up the next few weeks. Next week, we're going to hear from Mark Texter of Crosby Texter, who has been a strategic advisor to Conservative governments in Australia and the UK for quite some time. The week after, we're going to hear from Helen O'Neill, who has been an advisor to Labor governments, including the time the National Cultural Policy, but she's also the chair of PAC Australia, Performing Arts Connections Australia, former director of the British Council in Australia, among a range of important roles that Helen has held. But today, we are hearing from Nicholas Pickard, who is Executive Director of Public Affairs at APRA AMCOS. He has held a range of roles which we'll draw on in our discussion today. He was previously the Director of Corporate Affairs at the Copyright Agency. Nick has managed the profile and reputation of organisations and public figures across government, transport and infrastructure, creative industries and the media for over a decade. He's a former journalist and theatre critic. He's been advisor to federal and state government ministers. His first love is theatre. He has worked around the world in that context, in particular in Slovenia. He is the chair of the Australian Society of Authors and is also a board member of Regional Arts New South Wales. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Esther. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you. There is so much to ask you, and in the various roles that Nick has had, including being advisor to state and federal government ministers and working with federal government Labor ministers at the time of the writing of the National Cultural Policy. And then more recently, now with APRA AMCOS, Nick has become, in many ways, the most successful arts lobbyist in Australia in terms of achieving bipartisan outcomes. So a great deal to ask you. Let's start with the trajectory, I guess, that took you from a love and a passion for theatre, writing and directing, being a theatre critic, and then moving into policy and advising areas that have a really strong connection and relationship between communications, the public and policy. I think it's a really interesting trajectory.
So I was one of those people at uni that was always hanging around all the drama kids. I went to Macquarie University, so I was never a political beast. You'd see all those students going off to, all of the young political gatherings and all of those student union activities, and I never had any interest in that at all. So I always had this passion of theatre and presenting theatre as an artist. I was fortunate enough to be at a university at the time when Di Yerbury, who has had it was the Vice Chancellor at that time and had an interaction with arts quite a lot in her professional career over the decades. And she put a lot of money into investing in students to receive scholarships to study overseas. So as part of my Bachelor of Arts degree, I studied theatre theory in the United Kingdom and then studied theatre directing in Slovenia for a year and a half. So really I was, training to become a theatre director. I came back to Australia and I wasn't part of the NIDA, VCA, WAPA, clique, and theatre being a collective art form, I didn't have those real networks. So after trying to put on various productions in Sydney and Melbourne, through sheer frustration of the blockages, started to look at what were the structures around the funding of the arts. What were the structures that allowed artists to become artists, spaces to become spaces? What was what were the levers that government would use to create the environment for art to happen? And obviously, once you start diving into that, you start to come up with pretty clear, signals that there's a great lack of cultural policy, by and large, on all three levels of government. Very little is, coordinated, and there's very little what you might call moonshots. That sort of broader national ambition for our sector. And I started to write a blog, and I started this blog called Sydney Arts Journo, and I started writing policy pieces, questioning and examining arts policy. Started writing theatre reviews, and eventually ended up in the media, where I started writing for the Daily Telegraph, and then what was then known as the Fairfax newspapers. Did a little bit of work for the ABC and Crikey. And I suppose from that very beginning to where I am now, for me, it's always about the opportunity for the artist. So at the moment at APRA AMCOS, my major concern is songwriters and publishers. What is the opportunity for songwriting and music to happen in Australia? But having worked at a copyright agency, it was very much one where I was, my attention turned to authors and visual artists. And working for two Labor governments, one in New South Wales and then federally. So I worked with Helen O'Neill, who's your speaker the week after next. And we both worked together on the national cultural policy. And it's that sort of work that is really interesting, to be someone that's come from an arts vocation, an arts training, into a space that's largely filled with people that want to be political animals, So I was never part of that scene. So I was seen slightly oddly as somebody with experience and understanding of that portfolio. So yeah, does that answer your question?
It's great to have that overview and put that in that context, because it's about, there's things that motivate us in different ways, but then the training that we receive, and particularly the training to be a theatre director, to think in ways that bring together, a range of different inputs, that work with people that are responsive, that present a certain context, a certain situation, are not exactly the skills, as you say, that you would have been seeing alongside you when working in those political contexts. Tell us about the role of an advisor, and I'm going to ask you that the next question will be, tell us about the role of the lobbyist, so you can understand these distinct roles, because you just gave a great description of having come from a certain place of training, seeing gaps that were structural, that were big picture, that were political, and your instinct was to articulate those in writing for an audience, and to engage with the public. Your instinct wasn't to kind of the range of different, options that would have taken different career paths and so on. But it's intriguing that your instinct was to engage with the public through articulating those questions. And I'm struck that the role of an advisor and the role of a lobbyist do those, but in slightly different ways. So tell us about what the role of a political advisor is.
I'll just take one step back.
Yes.
And I think that the theatre reviewing was really critical in my understanding about politics to a certain degree. Theatre reviewing, particularly with the Daily Telegraph and the Sunday newspapers, you'd have to condense a review, tell somewhat of a story of an entire theatre production, all in the space of about 100 words. And you had to make it, through that constant training of editing of copy, something that you would expect the general public, and you mean that in the most general sense, the general public would find either appealing or B, engaging. So that in itself was an amazing training to then go into a political office, where I had no experience whatsoever of political advising, and so when you walk in as an advisor to a minister, you both have a portfolio hat on and you have a political hat on. So anything that you're trying to push, whether it's new funding, and it can be as simple as that. You just want to try and get more funding. You know, that can be often, you know, just the end game, because you know that there's a shortage. And in many ways, what you're trying to do within the walls of government is sell the concept of why more funding should go to the arts, and you're often doing it through the prism of what would the general public expect, and why would they accept it, and why would they agree for their taxes to be used in that way. So I think in many ways I found myself as an insider, an industry insider in government, treading this fine line between meeting and speaking with lots of different arts groups and really trying to distill what are the big things that are going to help as many people I've met. Because you're never going to satisfy everyone. You're never going to be able to say, oh, you know, A organisation and B organisation and Y organisation want this, that and the other. You're never going to be able to deliver that. But what you might be able to deliver is to try and find some sort of unity and purpose. And that's where a good minister and a good government gets buy-in from the sector. And that doesn't have to be just about the arts. That should be done in health policy. It should be done in policy with First Nations people. It should be done in all sorts of policy areas. So if you get that buy-in, you get that, hopefully that shared outcome. We had a number of different forums where arts organisations and artists were directly engaged. And there were some key, outcomes that were really required by the sector. You know, one of them was obviously funding. The second one was more nimble grant-making procedures. At the time, you could only ever, apply for money 6 months in advance of something that might happen in 12 months' time. You know, it was really lumbersome. I mean, you've all probably experienced that sort of grant-making and process. And the third one was space. People wanted space to create. You know, that was sort of the big takeaways. And so that was the sort of things that we were fighting for. So that's where things like the various spaces in regional and metropolitan New South Wales, Pier 2-3 came out, Carriage Works was another policy outcome, and a general increase to the arts funding program in New South Wales. So I was quite fortunate in the fact that we had good allies within the walls of government, and that could be within particular advisors in other ministers' offices, and because you really do need to get that buy-in. You need to get that buy-in internally around a cabinet table and with different officers. And if you can find an ally, that makes your job so much easier, because when a budget is handed down by a government, every other policy portfolio, and that's everything from health, education, social issues, environmental issues, the whole lot. So you're competing at that level. And the more you can make it politically appealing for the powers that be, the more, in my experience, the successful you can be.
Let's talk about that buy-in and those allies, because in a sense, particularly for the arts, and you were saying earlier, and this is before we go into the lobbyist conversation, because this is from the outside now, but staying with this for a moment, you were saying earlier about when you're condensing, thinking about a theatre piece into that 100 words, you're very much thinking about the general public. When you're advising a minister, you are very much thinking about the general public, the taxpayer. How will people respond to this? How do ministers and their colleagues have a sense that this is wanted, that this is appreciated? That sense of the allies and the buy-ins that are needed from that minister's colleagues. I imagine some of that is probably a matter of luck. Some of it is a matter of who's got an interest in the arts. Some of it is who can understand and is willing to be receptive to that relationship between the arts and their portfolio area. And then some of it, of course, is how you, as the advisor, leverage that understanding of public acceptance, of public sentiment, and so on. What are some of the ways that that buy-in is built, and that role of the advisor working beyond the relationship of just their own minister?
I think listening is probably the central part of it. You're listening for what are the other policy priorities of a government. You're listening for what is the media narrative that's going on around you. What is that clamour like? So if you think back to 2008, 9, 10, for those of you not in New South Wales, that led into the 2011 New South Wales election that basically removed, a really long-standing Labor government in 2011, and that government was really turfed out on a number of pretty big policy issues, and there was a narrative around that government that they hadn't done very much, So, but certainly within the art space, there is something in the political cycle where if you're running towards the end of a term, when you're running towards what looks like a defeat, you can suddenly, start really pushing hard in a policy sense to try and get outcomes, because you find ministers and governments wanting to leave legacy. And it's amazing how the arts comes up when you want to put down legacy. Suddenly they want spaces, suddenly they want, those items. It's a very interesting time. And both times that I've been advisors have been the end of governments. They've been the sort of last 2 or 3 years of governments. So in many ways, that was a fortune, because we were able to deliver quite a lot in that short amount of time. The problem comes after that, when that work is undone. So to get the buy-in, I just noticed Alex putting a question about advocating through the prism of what the general public would accept. And did I also focus on how to shift what the public would accept? Absolutely, but it's always got to be conscious of what the public would accept, because if you do stuff that goes beyond the bounds of what is publicly acceptable from a government point of view, I don't mean as an artist point of view, from a public point of view, that can do more damage than good. So it's critical that you set up the narrative in the public domain as to why you are doing this. So in all of those situations, you are focusing on shifting what the public would accept, but at the same time doing it within the bounds of understanding what it is that would be in the end acceptable, and limit, particularly in volatile political cycles, when you know that you're going to get hit from various media outlets or various media figures, you need to really just have a bit of an eye to that. So I think that is another important part of buy-in, is understanding your limitations.
And I think Gabrielle's comments also put a comment about that limitation, that turning that policy into a reality must always be a compromise with so many parties and interests to be managed. And I guess that's the thing, that kind of work that you do compromise must be the sort of starting point, particularly when you say that notion of legacy and having to perhaps craft a proposal in such a way that the relevant minister will be in that receptive mode to understand that this will be a way of achieving a certain kind of legacy while also having an important capacity building impact. That is a tightrope.
Absolutely.
I'm going to ask about the opposite now, being a lobbyist. But first, I see that Bronwyn has gone to the Carriage Works and Powerhouse questions. Good question, Bronwyn. Let me just, before I ask Bronwyn's question, I have neglected to point out that I think, as many of you know, this session is live captioned. And hello to Helen, our captioner in Brisbane. Leah Reid, our Communication Advocacy Manager, who's also on the line with us, has posted the link to the live captioning. It's just at the very top of the chat there. So super useful if the instant text is of help. So Bronwyn says, Nick's mentioned a few times about spaces and just now legacy for government, as we've seen, and ministers, as we've seen with Carriage Works and the Powerhouse. The big fancy building seems to be far easier to get traction on than the ongoing operational costs. How can we make the costs of running these spaces more palatable politically and to the general public?
Yeah, that is something that I battle with all the time as well. You know, I've seen quite a few governments invest heavily in the bricks and mortar of the arts, and certainly as part of what we did in New South Wales back 2010, you probably also remember that there was a huge Renew Newcastle movement. So it wasn't just about the presentation spaces like Carriage Works and Pier 23. It was also about providing, you know, retail, empty retail space in city centres, you know, really trying to activate those sorts of spaces as well. And there was a deep, from memory, deep frustration, particularly within the performing arts, with the lack of rehearsal space. So that was sort of seen as another. But of course, you know, rehearsal spaces don't have a big plaque on the front either. So it is. I think that is the big battle. One of the big battles that we all need to really get more governments over the line to be just as proud of opening a space as to providing opportunities to create and present within them. You know, that's, you know, just thinking for New South Wales at the moment, there's a huge amount of infrastructure being built in regional areas, but there's not the correlation between creating in those spaces as well, which is going to be, you know, something that is going to be really problematic, because if you've got empty space and it's not being, you know, employed for the right purpose, you know, what happens to those empty spaces? What do the locals suddenly start to ask for, you know? And that means the changing of the purpose.
Oh, precisely. And Rob's just made the very, very important point that he's very happy to have a nice big plaque in any one of his rehearsal spaces. And yeah, I too would be very happy to host a plaque. I quite like plaques, and we'll happily present one anywhere at all. Now, just bringing together some of the points that you've just been making there about that connection to the general public, about buy-in, about that gap between, you know, some of the ongoing issues and the legacy issues, and Kate's comment about hoping that politicians taking an interest in articles in the arts media. There's then that question of, it's also up to us as a sector and industry, as artists, as organisations, as arts leaders, to be continually maintaining those relationships with our elected members, so that there is a, you know, a two-way, a multiple-way conversation happening, and that buy-in is something that people can be a part of altogether. I mean, it must be really frustrating when you've been in situations, for example, where a particular policy approach is being developed, and it's something that you know would have great impact, that industry conversations have confirmed would have great impact, but at a propitious moment there is perhaps this disconnection between the broader industry conversation and what needs to happen, which can be difficult for the parliamentary colleagues to understand that there is buy-in. How would you characterise that broader set of relationships between, you know, us as a big, complex, diverse sector and the political relationships that are needed to ensure that ongoing connection and some really great outcomes?
Just before we get there, I'd also like to, you know, after I've answered this, reflect on the parallel relationship with the media, which came up in a question before, because I think they're sort of both sides of the
Yes.
same coin,
Yes.
particularly in a changing media landscape. And what does that look like for us? Because all the arts journalists are disappearing. All of that knowledge is gone. And where do we go and what does that mean? On a political sense, the thing that I always say to people is that, okay, at the end of the day, a cabinet of senior ministers around a cabinet table are the ones that decide the government policy. So if you imagine that there's 20 people sitting around a table, you've got the Premier or the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, you've got various portfolios sitting around that table, and they're usually health, education, federally you'll have defence, you'll have environment, you'll have hopefully the arts portfolio sitting there. You'll have regional development, you'll have trade, you'll have economic development. Now, you don't want a situation whereby the only person advocating for increased support for the arts sector is from the arts minister only. You need to get buy-in from the other people around that table. It can't be something that you're relying on one person to get you across the line. So it's absolutely important that you frame what you're saying of relevance to the other portfolios. That's something that I'm doing a lot of at APRA AMCOS, but it's hard work. It is hard because they keep saying, oh, go and talk to the arts minister. At APRA, we represent 103,000 songwriters. Each of them are a small business. So I want to talk to the small business minister. You know, a whole heap of those songwriters are exporting to the world because, you know what, I want to talk to the trade minister about that. I want to talk about the problems with visas and some of the issues that they're facing, trying to get into markets, selling Australian content. Look, I'm talking in a really, you know, flat purpose here, something, you know, trying to find synergies with portfolios. But I also want to talk about skills. So I want to talk to the education minister and I want to see what that skills training framework looks like to create the very best songwriters we have in this country so that we can start investing more and more into this intellectual property, which we call a song. So it's really important to try and get that that approach when you're dealing with governments. I also want to talk to the economic development minister because live music generates cultural and economic activity, particularly in nighttime economies, and they help foster safe nighttime economies because evidence is increasingly showing that live music actually encourages people to go out and go to something rather than just going out to go and drink. So we're finding, particularly in areas like Newcastle, Wollongong, that live music is tempering a lot of sharp edges around nighttime economic activity. So that's really that's the articulation of what that means when trying to foster those relationships with ministers. So it's not just the arts minister you should be inviting to an exhibition opening or a gallery opening or anything like that. You should be really trying to foster other relationships if you can shoehorn it into other portfolios.
Oh, hear, and Lisa Corsi's saying that is the approach that will bust the arts out of the silo it's being condemned to. But also Nick has just beautifully demonstrated the answer to my next question is what's involved in being a lobbyist, because you've just so clearly articulated from the point of view of the music industry what the connections are to those, to a range of portfolios. We've been reflecting during this program that the arts minister, you know, by definition, they're already on side. They are motivated to achieve a legacy in their portfolio. They want to achieve success. And so I think that's just, really clearly articulated a lobbying approach there. There are a number of questions, which is great. So we're going to turn to them and then wrap up with a sense of the big picture and what's needed next. So first of all, Nadia Odlum has said, Nick, you mentioned that although things can get pushed through at the end of one government's term, there's always the risk that it will be rolled back, as you were saying. In the document Esther put together, also Nick, everyone's received a kit as part of our program. And in that kit, I have what seems a miraculous work. I have a single A5 page that details the history of arts policy in Australia by political party. In the document Esther put together showing the history of arts policy in Australia, we see that constantly small gains are soon being reversed. Can you think of any qualities of policies that you've seen that have managed to last or avoid this? It's a tough one, isn't it?
Look,
maybe the Australia Council.
One of the things, if I reflect on both of the governments that I worked for, that it would have been ideal for the sector who had that buy-in, particularly around the national cultural policy, not only to be talking heavily with the opposition arts spokesperson, George Brandis, but also other members of that future LNP government, because it was a really easy task for him to come in after the 2013 election and just undo everything, because the small group of people that he was talking to were generally quite opposed to the Australia Council, and and that sort of helped provide that vehicle for Catalyst to come into being. So what I'm essentially saying is that it's incumbent on all of us to not only be talking to, and this is, it's full on. It is so, and I'm lucky that I have a job that affords me that 80% of my time I can be working on lobbying. Not many organisations have that. So you have to be realistic about what you can and can't resource. Try and find those synergies with other organisations so that you can share the load, and really prioritise what your hit list needs to be. But one of the, the second hit list really needs to be in your advocacy toolkit is the opposition, and so it's kind of, probably not to the greatest degrees you would with spending time with government, ideally spending time with a couple of key figures in the opposition to ensure that that you're also fostering that and planting those seeds for when they inevitably get into power.
Yeah, and kind of thinking long term, but also thinking realistically about the contest that is politics and the points of difference that that people need to position, but also thinking about clearly positioning those legacy, the things that will be advantageous, and people can form different. Can plug in that connection, that buy-in in different ways, but that achieve policy goals in terms of their own party's principles, which leads us to Anna Cordingley's question. Hello, Nick. She says, I would love to know about the processes you and others undertook in developing the Creative Australia National Cultural Policy. In this cohort, we have often lamented that a national cultural policy has not been championed beyond that brief moment in 2013, and then, of course, back in 1993-94. Have you a reflection on this? Is it still a relevant document in your eyes? And while Nick's thinking about that, I'll also point out, of course, that in last year's election campaign, Labor did undergo a more limited policy consultation process, but endorsing key aspects of that. So, yeah, is it still? How do you see that as a relevant document for today?
To be honest, I think any big cultural announcements for our sector are important, and you find that particularly big cultural policy documents, they do shift the narrative and advance key parts of the policy conversation. Now, if you look at the package that delivered the cultural policy, barely anything is left really out of that. I think maybe the creation of Creative Partnerships Australia is one of the parts that has remained, and certainly the arts training, arts ready program, which was based on the Sports Ready program, that still continues. But I think that if you read the document, and it's worthwhile reading even just the executive summary again when you have a chance, and look at the 5 key policy priorities that were placed around that, and you can actually see that they are still driving a lot of conversation today. So I think it does make a difference. Even with the federal government's announcement a couple of weeks ago for an arts and entertainment package, that also, shifted the dialogue in many ways. And it was really interesting to look at the language that the Prime Minister and the Minister and the Treasurer used around that, elevating not just artists, but also the people that work. It was kind of like, arts policy in a fluoro. There were the tradie parts, the ecosystem, if you like, that surrounds the presentation of the arts. So I think, by and large, any big moments like that do make a difference, because they do put in the public domain a hook, a narrative, a statement. So in many ways, that's true. It's really hard to think of things that are really lasted, but I would say that the Australia Council has lasted in a largely bipartisan way. Look, admitting that there's swings and roundabouts with that. The Australian Film Commission, now Screen Australia, still exists. So the training institutions, things like the Australian Ballet School, the National Performing, what's it called? The National Academy of Music, the
ANAM.
Yeah, ANAM. So there's the Circus Academy. So that training still is largely bipartisan. But it's interesting. A think tank called A New Approach, which was only formed last year, came up with some analysis looking at, which I thought was quite interesting, comparing what is funded by the local, state and federal governments. And local now is seen as the largest investor in the cultural and arts sector by quite a fair way. But how do we unite that purpose? How do we get a national approach through local government? That's something that really, and you kind of hope that the federal government would do that, but it's not a relationship that you see very much of.
I think it's a really important point. Tomorrow, on a smaller scale to our conversations, NAVA is hosting a policy event called What's Next for the Visual Arts, Craft and Design sector. And we're hearing from all levels of government. And our guest on local government will be Francesca Valmorbida from the Municipal Association of Victoria. And in the notes that she sent through, she's making some very clear strategic points about the the untapped potential of working really closely with local government on a national scale. I think it's absolutely a missed opportunity. Just going back along the chat now to see if I've missed some questions. Alex Marsden has pointed out the forgotten lessons from the 1988 bicentennial in New South Wales, when there are a number of museums and galleries that were built and opened in a lead-up, but later struggled, and many closed because of lack of ongoing funding. And that is that whole problem, as Nick mentioned, about legacy, and as we've said in different contexts about the edifice complex of launching something but then not committing that ongoing funding, and being concerned about adding, I guess, future investments and future liabilities. And of course, around 88 wasn't just that, but we also had an explosion of universities in Australia through reclassification, and now we're seeing some concerning changes there in terms of the funding of arts and humanities degrees. And so again, it just makes it all the more important for us all to be joining those dots between the arts and education, the arts and regional development, and so on. Yeah, just so important. Kate Smith, good point. Always leave the NAVA chat with a reading list. So a new approach research, it's by the Australian Academy for the Humanities. So if you Google Australian Academy for the Humanities new approach, you'll find that there's 3 reports that they've put out in the last 3 years. The most recent one is about public sentiment. They've done some qualitative studies and, extended focus groups and so on. There's also a report about, as Nick was saying, that comparison between local, state and federal funding across a multi-year period. And then the middle report is about bringing together a bunch of research about arts and health, arts and education, and making a few big picture, charting some big picture directions. So yeah, lots to have a look at there. So, goodness me, we have got just over 10 minutes of Nick's time left before we go into more of our workshop and start talking about some of the other questions people have asked about bringing us together, and that leads us to Arts Day on the Hill. Let's talk now about, to leave us on that big picture, and thinking about what's needed next, because Nick, you have approached this work from a multitude of ways and in such intense and engaged ways. I'm going to ask you in a moment a question about some of those big picture next steps that are needed. But in the meantime, a question from Kate Smith: any tips from when you were an advisor on how to present a negative "we want money" ask in a positive way? And this has been a real problem, I think, for the sector. So much of just, asking for money, asking for the arts to be funded, as opposed to making the case for, specifically the what and the why and what the value is. Maybe is there an example you can give us in a non-identifying way of being an advisor and having, an arts colleague come and try and lobby you in a way that was, I'm sure, very well-meaning, but must have been quite frustrating?
Look, there's probably a couple of things. So we want money, that's investment. So we want the government to invest in a positive way, because it's going to be a partnership. So we want the government to partner with X to, and then really try and find what it is that you're doing that might tap into the policy priorities that you've heard or seen the government articulate. Now, any government, regardless of its colour, is going to articulate certain policy priorities. The Prime Minister gave a speech, a National Press Club address, about 6 weeks ago, and he was talking about the services sector and how he really wanted the services sector to be, part of the post-COVID recovery. So me, in my sort of opportunist way, said, well, as far as I'm concerned, the music industry is a services sector and we are part of the digital economy because that's how we deliver. So I, articulated some things and got in contact with the Prime Minister's office just to sort of, it was part of the big push prior to the government's announcement. I was basically trying to throw everything at this particular lobbying effort, everything, including the kitchen sink, trying to find any way in to try and push through some sort of A, recognition that our sector was in trouble, and B, acknowledge it with some sort of financial support. So, that's really how, I think when you are presenting something that you want money for, you've got to look at it in the positive, that it's an investment. And, with government partnering on it, they'll be able to, get certain outcomes that will help benefit, various things, whether it's a local community or it's a school or it's a regional area or it's, the arts presents, just by definition, the arts does so much. So, you've really got a bit of a magic pudding there as far as what you can and can't articulate as part of the outcomes. It's just being willing to embrace that.
All right, let's now look at the big picture of the next few years and the kinds of things that we should be collectively imagining, the kinds of visioning that I think, you know, we need to do together, and really look at raising the bar on what's needed policy and program wise in Australia at the moment. So we're obviously in the middle of a pandemic and a global economic crisis. Some of us, such as the Victorians, are in more of a lockdown situation than others, and the amount of investment that all levels of government are having to make right now, simply to, you know, keep the boat afloat, to use the word everyone keeps using, unprecedented. So we're in this place at the moment where, as you were just describing, we need to be doing a number of things at once. We need to be looking and listening to what government is saying, what the Prime Minister is saying about what are those points of value that we can plug into. But then when we look to the long term, we know that money and investment is going to be so tight in so many different ways, unless we're able to articulate what it is about investment in the arts, in communities, in entertainment, in the creative economy. This is going to be a time where, of course, every other sector and subsector of the community, of the economy, is going to be attempting to do exactly the same thing. So when we look at that big picture for Australia, what do you foresee? What are the ways in which is it about us finding a different narrative? Is it about us being bolder? Is it about us being more connected? What sorts of things do you foresee next for us as advocates in Australia?
I think a partnership approach is going to be really critical. You started to see it a little bit in the last, particularly it came out a lot in the bushfire period. I did a lot of work with APRA set up an organisation called the Live Music Office, and there's an advisor there by the name of John Wardle who is a really an amazing brain on the regulatory impact that local and state government regulations have on the presentation of live music and by and large cultural activity within local areas. And we started talking a lot to tourism bodies. We started talking a lot to the hospitality sector. So I think that a partnership approach with these parts of the economy are going to be really, really important, particularly as we look at what's going to really turn the dial to get the economy started again. And you will find that every art form is going to be relevant in that particular conversation, because people are going to, you know, there was an interesting stat I saw last week, is that international tourists bring in this huge amount of money every year, and people have been talking about international tourism falling off a cliff. When Australians travel overseas, they take 3 times that amount of money out of the country. So it's a really interesting situation that we're in. So we're going to be really trying to get domestic tourists to be going back into, you know, and I'm talking very much in a city to city, city to region, regional to city type tourism model. Arts are going to be really important.
Interrupt you, Nick. So did you just say that Australian tourists overseas take away 3 times as much money as tourists bring into Australia?
Yeah.
That's astounding.
How crazy is that?
Yeah.
So the arts, you know, and there's organisations like the Tourism Transport Forum, you know, an amazing organisation that really, you know, they're one of the organisations front and centre that talk about the value of arts and culture to tourism and transport. You know, so we're going to see a lot of that sort of opportunity coming up, and it's something that we should really embrace and try and drive forward. And you know, the Australia Council released that report about 3 months ago, looking at the value of regional tourism, cultural tourism. You know, so this is by and large a massive part of what we're going to be talking about, and finding those synergies with other portfolios and other industries is going to be really critical. The other thing that really we're going to have to try and get a head around is that budgets are going to be really tight. So there's big financial statements around our sector are going to be really hard to come by. So it's going to be something that we really try and squeeze, the blood out of other stones that might exist. So that comes back into the partnership approach as well. I think it's going to be really critical that we ensure that the forward estimates for organisations like the Australia Council, those funding buckets are retained. I think that's going to be a really important conversation, because the federal budget will be handed down. Is it October? Early October?
Yeah.
So that's not that far away. We're nearly in August, September. So 10 weeks' time, we're going to be talking about the federal budget. I think the other part that we really need to start articulating quite a lot more on, and that's quality arts education. I think that as far as articulating the importance of those skills, both as arts practitioners and with creative skills, and you look at the models like Vietnam, Singapore, China, and the investment that they're making in creative skills, if we're going to compete with the future of our economy within, as a nation in the Asia Pacific Rim, we're going to need to be having those conversations. So I think a lot more research around that is going to be critical.
Oh, completely agree. Let me just scroll back on some of the responses that people have made. People are, as Kate was saying about the reading list, people have added a number of more reading tips, as have I. So we've just resourced ourselves up there with some next reading. And accordingly points out that in the just post-recession years, colleagues making work and talking about how thrilling it was in the face of scant funding, as momentum was rebuilding, the sector was redefining itself, and that sense that our recovery might be similarly rousing. I think that's incredibly important.
I think there's a really big opportunity. I mean, you can see, like, my world at the moment is music, and you sort of see the way that songwriters are embracing, lockdown, and what sort of artistic expression that is creating. What are those opportunities that they're trying to plug into? And that's stuff that will be unruly. It will be, untested, but, it will be through that, that artistic strength of trialing and experimenting and finding things that resonate.
Well, we have just about run out of time with Nick. It has been, it's always fantastic to get to talk to you. I'm so glad that you were able to join us in a week that you are on leave. We have our now clumsy way of trying to thank you on the chat with the various thanks and applause kind of symbols that we're able to contribute there with everyone. But thank you to everyone for such fantastic questions. There's just been such a rich and broad-ranging discussion. Rob McReady says, thanks, can Nick come every week?
Sure.
I would love that. That would be fantastic. Yeah, look, that was really, really fantastic. Now, we're going to keep chatting, but everyone, please join me very, very much in thanking Nicholas Pickard.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Now, Nick is going to press the goodbye button. We will say bye to Nick, and then we will continue our conversation. I'm so glad the internet clung on for us all. It's just been so precarious. Yeah, great discussion. How great was that to have that perspective from that whole trajectory, because again, he is a trained theatre director, to have this experience where, you go overseas, you see the different ways in which things work, you come back and you haven't had that that stereotypical trajectory, and then to have that focus then on, okay, there are big picture issues here that are preventing me and others from this kind of success. Let's really examine those. Yeah, that was incredibly interesting. Please keep your questions going so that we can keep talking a little bit about what Nick has just brought up. But it's also a great opportunity for us to keep talking about Arts Day on the Hill, which again is just one way of bringing our different voices together. And a lot of the questions tonight have been about how do we bring those conversations together? How do we get that impact? What if we had a national advertising budget? That'd be nice, and could really, get that impact. Kaz asked, how can we bring advocates together for a common goal, an event, a function, a meeting, piece by piece? This is very much the focus of Arts Day on the Hill, and you'll see that in the last week, as we were saying last week, we have opened up applications for you to join us as an advocate or as a media spokesperson. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, and thank you to Leah for just posting the link to that survey, and also thank you in advance, Leah, for posting the link to Arts Day on the Hill on our website. Arts Day on the Hill is something that NAVA started last year as a collaboration across art forms, across organisations, so that all of us, in the limited ways that we have, as Nicholas just pointed out, very few organisations in the arts can afford to employ someone like him. Nick's entire focus is lobbying the government. He was saying that 80% of his work is that lobbying work, and the other 20, of course, is that industry engagement, working with colleagues internally and externally. And that's a really important asset for the music industry and for APRA AMCOS. So in the absence of those kinds of resources, the opportunity for us is, as we've been doing throughout this program, to skill ourselves up in various aspects of advocacy, the arts aspects, the policy aspects, the media aspects, the political aspects, so that we can have some great impact on this. Oh, Renu, lovely to see you again, and see you next time. Bye. So Arts Day on the Hill is the 12th of August. Last year, when we could gather in one place, we had a national application process for just one advocate per state. And then instead of doing a program like this, open to everyone week after week, we went to Canberra for 2 days of workshops with a fantastic range of presenters. Then we had a launch event for the Parliamentary Friendship Group, and you've met John Alexander, Maria van Bakjeno and Adam Bant last week talking about that. And then we did a couple of days of solid back-to-back meetings with MPs, but we also had 1 day of critical mass advocacy. We did it online, through social media, we did it through the conventional media, and it was about all of those organisations who were involved, and artists, coming up with some shared messages about, okay, what do we want to achieve today? So we're inviting you to join us on that day. It's going to be, of course, open to everyone to just, use the hashtag Arts Day on the Hill and contribute. But what we'd especially like is to continue some of the focused workshop stuff we've been doing the last few weeks. And we're asking you to join us either as an advocate or as a media spokesperson. If you're interested in joining us as a media spokesperson, we will have an additional workshop on being a media spokesperson ahead of Arts Day on the Hill. We will brief media on who our spokespeople are, give them small bios, some quotes from you, so that we can have some stories on that day about what artists are saying is needed for the arts in Australia right now. And of course, connect you with each other and together build that critical mass on that day. So that's what's involved in being a media spokesperson. If you'd like to join as an advocate, we're hoping to find a really great diverse range of advocates per state and territory. And that's really to encourage your colleagues, artists who you know, organisations and networks in your network, to join in on this critical mass and see what kind of impact we can have on one day. Again, looking at what's needed in the arts right now, bringing together all the conversations that we've been having lately, so that we can not only achieve some great media impact, but connect with a number of MPs across the federal parliament. They will be sitting on that day. and also to build relationships that we can really extend into the long term. And this has been a recurrent conversation for us through the entire NAVA advocacy program. So I've still got the media one up, and I have yet to update the handbook. I've just switched the view, so please tell me if, like me, you can now see the front page of the advocacy handbook on your screen. You can. Oh, good. Good. So going to scroll down to, and I'm just delighted that this page has been very popular. I think I've told you before just what a drama it was to put together. And again, that's our background. That's not something that we would use to advocate to people with, but this is our background of, okay, I'm going to meet an MP, or I'm going to have a conversation, or I'm going to tag them into a post on the socials. It's good to have that background of, you know, what has come before and what some of the issues are. Let's go back to now engaging with the media and being a media spokesperson, so that, oh, where did it go? Here we go. So that we've got that sense of what are we going to achieve on Arts Day on the Hill. Just out of curiosity, who among us this evening has got some experience of engaging with the media? Have you been interviewed by journalists before? Do you perhaps run an organisation where you have a publicist, or you've got that kind of ongoing way of maintaining those media relationships? Are they good relationships? Are they frustrating ones? Is it really annoyingly time-consuming managing those relationships? Please tell us. I know I can see that there's a few of you on the call/click meeting who do run organisations or are in organisations. So yeah, tell me, what is your current relationship with the media and also with politicians? So Caroline Phillips is saying a tiny bit, a few radio interviews mostly. We're volunteers, so it's hard to make it a priority. Yeah, absolutely. Caroline, tell everyone a little bit about where you're from and what your organisation is. I think you make a really important point there, and you know, just about everyone who we speak to in this kind of context, especially, you know, when it's artists, you know, trying to maintain relationships with media as well, and with politicians. It's always that extra voluntary work, isn't it? It's something that you've got to really feel that's going to be a value of it for you in order to make it a priority. Otherwise, it can be very difficult to make it a priority. And you certainly don't want to be, you know, kind of, yeah, butting your head up against a wall. It's so frustrating. Now, please, as you're posting, yeah, tell us what kind of organisation you work for, just to introduce yourselves to each other. So Bronwyn Colston is saying, writing lots of media releases and trying to get our news into the media as often as possible, but due to the council hierarchy, have no authority to speak directly to state or federal politicians. Yeah, Bronwyn, this is a huge issue for galleries, huge issue. And I worry that, yeah, in some contexts, this is worsening as risk aversion increases. That can be so difficult, and having that structure of, you know, when is the council hierarchy happy for you to speak about things and when not. So I think that's one of those things that points to NAVA's role in terms of the kinds of things that we can say that others can't, but also things that we can, you know, help to kind of push out there. And accordingly designed for state opera and theatre companies. And we're always being roped in to generate enthusiasm prior to openings. Everybody loves a behind-the-scenes shot from a costume workroom. It's so true. And I think that's super important, and goes to our group activity question here about how do you engage with the media, and what do journalists ask, you know, if you're going to give someone a hook. into your world or your organization's world, what would it be? And certainly those behind the scenes insights are not just great for the media, but they are excellent first meetings with politicians to invite them over and give them an experience that's going to be, a bit hidden, a bit special and secret. Carolyn Phillips says she's secretary of the Women's Art Register, and they do lots of different activities and programming. So the outreach or advocacy part of things often ends up at the bottom of the list due to time constraints. But what you've just described there, Carolyn, with the different activities and programming is outreach and advocacy. And so I think that's a superb example of, in the early weeks of the advocacy program, we talked about, okay, well, what is advocacy? A way that I often describe it is that advocacy is you telling someone something. It could be a story, it could be a backstage insight, it could be this is how I made this work, but it's a story that is compelling because it's you who's telling it, so it's honest and authentic, and it perhaps will connect with a point that you're trying to make, maybe about something that's needed, about policy, about something in the public interest. And because of the way that you've told that story, it could be to anyone, it could be to, someone at the local shops, because of the way you've told it, that person is compelled to tell that story again, to repeat that story to someone else, whether they agree with you or not. And that's what I mean by advocacy that's really well distributed. That's a conversation that keeps going, because when we're practiced in doing that, we're so much more comfortable to talk to the media and talk to politicians. Yvonne East says that she had a good relationship with the local paper back in her hometown. The journalists loved the visuals. Oh, excellent. Also produced and hosted a community radio arts show for 4 years, and it was a great way to connect artists across platforms. Can I say, Yvonne, big respect. I have a long community broadcasting background, and I think radio is an exceptional format in the age of everything internet. The podcast and the ways in which we listen as opposed to viewing have become even more important. And I think those relationships to community media are crucial. People love it. It's connected to community, and it's incredibly important. Gabrielle Sullivan says, with the demise of arts coverage in mainstream media, specialist publications like Seesaw magazine and WA are critical. Then she emphasises she works with Seesaw. But can I just say, and as Diana was saying, she reads Seesaw, as do I. I think Seesaw is, brilliant and so, so important. And please post a link to Seesaw. This is about, building everyone's reading list as well. So please post that link. Adam Simmons is saying, yes, so as a rep for an organisation and as an individual artist, radio is easier, press is tricky, some online, some are helpful and open, some come with a predetermined angle. And we've spoken a lot about asking about the angle, seeing how you can maybe segue that angle into other things. And I mean, really, when we think about, radio requires 24 hours a day in a range of different programs, requires Esther's least favourite word, content, and, colour and movement. Radio presenters are constantly looking for great stories and the opportunity to speak in your voice, which is very different to just being quoted in a story. Nadia Odlum says, yes, a bit. Mostly interviews about her practice and projects she's been involved in. Always interesting to see what quotes or sound bites they choose. Crafting snappy sentences helps the core points get across. Yes, it does. Andy Vag pointing out that ABC Radio Hobart have always been good to the arts. It is true. Kate Smith has only done very local media stuff, had the best response when doing an art science project. I think you've mentioned that before. That's, intriguing. The science and environment stories, like me as an artist, I was a bit different in that world. So that importance of finding that point of difference. Rob McCready is co-director of a small dance organisation and does interviews from time to time for radio and online news. He's had the most success by writing a really well thought out media release, sometimes printed exactly as submitted. So true, Rob. The most difficult is being interviewed for a written article where the journalist sometimes unintentionally seriously misrepresents comments. Yeah, I've been in that situation as well, and it really points to how important that preparedness is. Yeah, it's one of those things, particularly, earlier in our careers, that happens to us once or twice, and we think, okay, now I'm going to be on my alert, think about certain journalists that I will and won't speak to. Yeah, it's super challenging. Local media is always more interested. Good point, Carolyn Phillips. Bronwyn Colston saying that she's learnt so much over the weeks here and have now pushed for approval, great, within local government to speak to Fiona Phillips, who has an office directly opposite the gallery and uses our forecourt for a lot of her media things. Good job. Jo Herbig, how are you? Jo Herbig and I used to work together. She says she has a good track record with media. It's true, she does. She's reached international media a couple of years ago with the Section 32 project. They were more interested in the philanthropist who donated the house, but it was a way in. If you can find something that might pique interest, something out of the ordinary, then it's a good hook. And I think that's the thing, is kind of, we've got our hook, but then knowing how are you going to make best use of it? Not just giving it to the journalist, but how does it really connect with what you need to say and want to say? Kaz Willis has been finding that lots of regional newspapers have been a bit negative, while community radio programs are always helpful. Within the Southern Highlands Arts Trail, there are many artists, but you end up being in competition with friends. This is such an important point. The council is a good advertiser, yet the idea is to bring tourists into the area. It's about tracking down journalists who have an interest in the arts. It really, really is, Kaz. But being in competition with friends to achieve media impact is super hard. That feeling of, I think we can get into that trap of thinking it's a zero-sum game. If I get coverage, you won't get coverage. But I think a way to kind of help, just to sort of reframe that is that I see advocacy and media coverage as expansive. If I get coverage, you're likelier to get coverage, because one of the things that we know from the way that the news values work is that journalists are actually motivated to continue with a story, particularly in the age of clicks and the online space. If something has been news today, if they're able to get another aspect, another angle on that the next day, they are more likely to continue because the interest has been piqued. People are looking at that story and then, what happened next? Well, this happened. No need for apologies for the typos, but thank you, Yvonne. It's always awkward typing into the chat. Totally understand. I know that some of us are on mobile devices, and no need for apology. Now, Sue Haslington is a councillor with Snowy Monero Regional Council. Excellent. Welcome, Councillor Haslington. And also studying arts as a nearly merged council. Are you nearly merged or newly merged? We have finally put together an arts and cultural committee, yay, and now working on a discussion paper for our community on the arts to do exactly what you're talking about, but also start an arts discussion. I'm also on Southeast Arts' board. Oh, excellent. So regional arts bodies are very supportive of local artists. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you to Gabrielle for posting Seesaw Mag and some comments there about how great Section 32 is. Thanks, Alicia. And Adam Simmons pointing out that regional ABC radio is often supportive, and sometimes it's broadcast across a much wider area or even statewide. Always check the expected coverage. Good tip, Adam. Also, of course, now it all just goes online. And so you might do an interview with a local radio station. Maybe it's the ABC, maybe it's community media. And because everyone's streaming also, it'll either be streamed nationally or they'll also cut it into something that you can just go back and listen to later. And so while we don't all necessarily have the experience of the liveness of tuning into the radio. People will be able to listen in later, and you can also then share it on social media as well. Yes, that competition, Kaz is saying, pitting studio against studio, but we all recommend each other. And Kate Smith, the rising tide lifts all boats. It really, really does. And that's part of the, you know, when we lament that there isn't great arts coverage, and then a journalist will pick something up and it's super exciting. You know, I'll often get a call the next day about, you know, can you put us in touch with so-and-so? And of course I do. And as I've lamented before, sometimes, you know, I do put journalists in touch with an artist, but the artist is not comfortable about speaking up, or they're not used to speaking to the media, which again is part of the focus of our workshops, but also part of the focus of the invitation for people to be media spokespeople around Arts Day on the Hill. So we've got all the information is on our website, and there will be an extra workshop session for people who choose to join us for that, because yeah, the more of us who are doing that, but also actively building those relationships, the better. It's so important. Let me just track back and make sure that I haven't missed any of our questions. It's great to have a regional council councillor with us, Sue, and thank you for joining us, because it's, you know, people join council, people become local councillors for a range of different reasons. I've got a couple of friends and one arts colleague who's about to run for local council. There are a number of local council elections coming up this year. And I think it's something that is really incredibly important, you know, all the ways to think about, you know, how do we engage with the democratic process. If you're happy to tell us, Sue, I would love to know how long you've been on council and what motivated you to join. Because certainly that can be, you know, the arena of the local council conversations and the breadth of what's covered is extraordinary. As Nick pointed out earlier, the combined local government investment in the arts very much outstrips total state and total federal government funding. And as we have pointed out in this series before, local government are, of course, also Australia's biggest owners of galleries and their collections. And so simply that asset value is absolutely extraordinary. Gabrielle Sullivan is saying, I don't suppose that visual artists have too many opportunities to meet and chat with arts journalists. Here's a tip. Go to performing arts shows and you'll find the arts writers in the foyer and surely know someone who could make an introduction. Well, when we can go back to the foyers, of course. Really great point, Gabrielle. You know, we've got gallery openings as well, but those social gatherings, I know sometimes people feel a bit, you know, anxious or uncomfortable about going up to a journalist at those things, but don't forget, that's why they're there. They want to meet with you. They want to get into conversations with artists. They really want your name and details and contact details so that down the track when they're thinking about a story and think, oh, you know, how do I contact an artist? Oh, that outstanding person came and spoke to me about that foyer. I'm going to get on the phone with them. So please always feel confident to just go up and speak to someone. Karen Kirkovan, can we all take part in Arts Day on the Hill? Of course you can. In fact, if you don't, I'm going to be personally very, very disappointed and sad. And it's just going to be Esther's glum face on the broadcast. That's all it's going to be. It's essential that we all take part in Arts Day on the Hill. Thank you, Leah, for posting that application there. So that's about being an advocate, where you will connect the program and the forum for the day with people across the country, and also a media spokesperson where we will have an additional separate workshop talking about exactly this, those techniques for engaging with the media. Will put you in touch with the media. But even for people who who don't apply, we're going to be encouraging everyone to join in online with the hashtag Arts Down the Hill on Wednesday, the 12th of August, so that we can really achieve a critical mass of advocacy, at least on social media, given it's going to be, very difficult to travel, and Parliament House is still, I believe, closed to the public. So the very minimum is to be using that day to talk about your practice, tag in MPs, introduce yourself, find out a little bit about them first, so that you can orient your public connection to them through an interest that they already have. And there's a world of information about that in the toolkit, which I will update this weekend, so that you can use the Australia Council's electorate profiles tool to find out more about your electorate. You can investigate their first speeches. We'll put all the links to all of that into the final chapter of the Arts Day on the NAVA Advocacy Program kit. And as we've said before, although our workshops are open to everyone, that kit is for NAVA members only. I would get in big fat trouble if we weren't focusing some of that specific stuff for our members, as well as being open to everyone with these programs. And of course, as I've mentioned before, NAVA membership starts at $7.50 a month. It is a great way to focus on amplifying your voice, developing your practice, strengthening your sector, and continuing to do great things together. Thank you, Leah, for posting the link to the membership information. And accordingly, is saying the live performance creatives generally avoid the critics lurking in foyers on opening nights, part of the intense ecology of the room. So I'm sure those critics would adore a visual artist popping up and engaging them. Gabrielle is also pointing out that is great tactical thinking. It's absolute genius. Of course, in the performing arts sector, you're there at someone's opening, they're going to be very nervous about what that journalist might write the next day. Whereas, of course, for everyone else, yes, sidle up, say hello, have the conversation. The same, of course, goes with politicians who are there to open something, or they've got some tickets to opening night, or they've been invited to your exhibition opening or one that you're attending. People often see the politician standing there looking awkward, thinking, oh, I can't go up and say hello. Of course you can. You're paying their salary. That is what they're there for. There are so many tips in this toolkit about the kinds of things to say, things to have found out about them first and foremost. But really, truly, there's no substitute for simply that confidence of being yourself, walking up, saying, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm an artist. I just wanted to introduce myself because your work as a journalist, as a parliamentarian, involves advocating for us and having that understanding of what we do. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about my work, my studio, my practice, etc. Have that conversation, invite them over. There are so many of us across the country. There are 4,500 NAVA members alone, let alone how many members did Nicholas just say that APRA AMCOS had? 100,000? Can you imagine if all of us were having these conversations with politicians, with the media on a regular basis? The critical mass of that would be astounding, and arts policy in Australia would transform, because as we were saying earlier, that connection between public perceptions, between achieving that buy-in, that connection between what politicians are hearing from their electorates, we would have that groundswell. It's absolutely where we need to be getting to. Now, once again, time is almost up. It is so fantastic to get to see you all and have these conversations, particularly because I'm in Melbourne and I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. So I've very much been enjoying my limited square meterage and all of you each week. Next week, we're going to have a similar conversation with a strategist and a lobbyist from the other side of politics. Mark Textor is a director, a principal of Crosby Textor. They are political campaign strategists who have won numerous elections for the Liberal Party in Australia and the Conservative Party in the UK. Sometimes when we talk about advocacy, we do risk staying within those conversations with people who, you know, are like-minded to us, maybe just having conservative conversations or just having conversations that are more progressive. And so it was great hearing from John Alexander, from Maria van Batjenor, and from Adam Band to hear three very different political approaches. Mark has been working on a range of campaigns which you won't know that they're him. So I suggest have a Google of Crosby Textor and of Mark before next week. And then the week after with Helen O'Neill, how to plan a meeting with a politician. Larissa Melanie saying she's working on her bravery to level up to go as a media spokesperson. The additional workshop sounds appealing/reassuring. Look, I think appealing/reassuring is going to be like the tagline for that workshop. I think that's exactly what it needs to be. So thank you so much for saying that, Larissa. And everyone, thank you very much for joining us again. The workshop today, as ever, has been recorded. The recording and the transcription will appear on our website tomorrow. We will see you at the same time next week. Victorians and Melburnians, stay strong. Everyone else, please keep thinking of us, and see you all at the same time next week. Thank you, everyone, for the great questions tonight. Really great conversation. Good night.